Welcome to the read-along time. We're going to continue on with Chapter 2 of The Borrowers, so we've started a new book. Just to remind you, so far you have a girl named Kate and an older relative, some kind of relative, she doesn't really know how, named Mrs. May lives with them. And they do things like crocheting, and Kate lost something, and Mrs. May seemed to make it sound like there are tiny people living in homes who take things, and that's why things go missing. Now, she was told this by her brother, who says that he actually knew some of these people that he called borrowers. And so now, here's where it gets a little bit different. We're going to have Mrs. May telling this story to Kate. Now, this is about her brother and what happened with her brother when he was a little boy. So this is from a long time ago. So now the rest of the story from here on out is being narrated by Mrs. May. Now I don't want to have to try to make an old lady voice every time the narrator starts. Just remember, the narrator is Mrs. May talking about her brother. Now, what we do know about him so far is he was sick, and that's why he had to go live in this other house for a while. And this is where he got to know the borrowers. Okay. Oh, and they had said that their names were Pod, Homily, and Arietti. So we'll get to know more about them. It was Pod's hole, the keep of his fortress. That's the hole under the clock in the old house. The entrance to his home. Not that his home was anywhere near the clock. Far from it, as you might say. There were yards of dark and dusty passageway with wooden doors between the joists and metal gates against the mice. Pod used all kinds of things for these gates. A flat leaf of a folding cheese grater, the hinged lid of a small cash box, squares of pierced zinc from an old meat safe, a wire fly swatter. Not that I'm afraid of mice, Homily would say, but I can't abide the smell. In vain, Arietti had begged for a little mouse of her own, a little blind mouse to bring up by hand, like Eglatina had had. But Homily would bang with the pan lids and exclaim, "And look what happened to Eglatina!" "What?" Arietti would ask. "What did happen to Eglatina?" But no one would ever say. It was only Pod who knew the way through the intersecting passages to the hole under the clock, and only Pod could open the gates. There were complicated clasps made of hairpins and safety pins, of which Pod alone knew the secret. His wife and child led more sheltered lives in home-like apartments under the kitchen, far removed from the risks and dangers of the dreaded house above. But there was a grating in the brick wall of the house, just below the floor level of the kitchen above, through which Arietti could see the garden, a piece of graveled path and a bank where crocus bloomed in spring, where blossoms drifted from an unseen tree, and where later an azalea bush would flower, and where birds came and pecked and flirted and sometimes fought. The hours you waste on them birds, Homily would say, and when there's a little job to be done, you can never find the time. I was brought up in a house, Homily went on, where there wasn't no gratin, and we were all the happier for it. Now go off and get me the potato. So they live underneath the kitchen, under the floor. That's where their house is. Now, Homily and Arietti only ever live in their little house and all the little rooms they have. But there's a spot in the wall where there's an open grating so that things can't come underneath the house, but Arietti can look out. So she's able to do that. And notice Homily's kind of getting angry at her for always looking outside. It's kind of like parents getting mad for always watching TV or always being on a computer. So she wants her to be able to help more and right now she has to go get the potato. All right. That was the day when Arietti, rolling the potato before her from the storehouse down the dusty lane under the floorboards, kicked it ill-temperedly so that it rolled rather fast into their kitchen, where Homily was stooping over the stove. "There you go again," exclaimed Homily, turning angrily. "Nearly pushed me into the soup. And when I say potato, I don't mean the whole potato. Take the scissors, can't you, and cut off a slice." Didn't know how much you wanted," mumbled Arrietty. And Homily, snorting and sniffing, unhooked the blade and handle of half of a pair of manicure scissors from a nail in the wall and began to cut through the peel. So they're small, so they don't need a whole potato, do they? They just need a piece of the potato to be able to cut up for their soup. "Aw, you ruined this potato," she grumbled. "You can't roll it back now in all that dust, not once it's been cut open." "Oh, what does it matter?" said Arrietty. "There are plenty more." "Well, that's a nice way to talk. Plenty more? Do you realize, Homily," went on gravely, laying down the half-nail scissor, "that your poor father risks his life every time he borrows a potato?" "Well, I meant," said Arrietty, "that there are plenty more in the storeroom." "Well, out of my way now," said Homily, bustling around again. "Whatever you meant, you let me get the supper." Arrietty wandered through the open door into the sitting room. Ah, the fire had been lighted, and the room looked bright and cozy. Homily was proud of her sitting room. The walls had been papered with scraps of old letters out of waste paper baskets, and Homily had arranged the handwriting sideways into vertical stripes which ran from floor to ceiling. On the walls, repeated in various colors, hung several portraits of Queen Victoria as a girl. These were postage stamps, borrowed by Pod some years ago from the stamp box on the desk in the morning room. There was a lacquer trinket box, padded inside, and with the lid open, which they used as a settle. And that useful standby, a chest of drawers made of matchboxes. There was a round table with a red velvet cloth, which Pod had made from the wooden bottom of a pillbox, supported on the carved pedestal of a knight from the chess set. This had caused a great deal of trouble upstairs when Aunt Sophie's eldest son, on a flying midweek visit, had invited the vicar for a game after dinner. Rosa Pickhatchet, who was housemaid at the time, gave in her notice. After she had left, other things were found to be missing, and no one was engaged in her place. From that time onward, Mrs. Driver ruled supreme. The knight itself, its bust, so to speak, stood on the column in the corner, where it looked very fine, and lent that air to the room which only statues can give. So hopefully you're getting an idea that all these little things they've collected are now in their little house. So they used the bottom of a piece of chess to make the bottom of a table. And then the top of that chess piece they use kind of like as a statue to kind of make it look fancy in their house. Beside the fire in a tilted wooden bookcase stood Arrietty's library. This was the set of those miniature volumes which the Victorians loved to print, but which to Arrietty seemed the size of very large church Bibles. There was Bryce's Tom Thumb Gazetteer of the World, including the last census, Bryce's Tom Thumb Dictionary, with short explanation of scientific, philosophical, literary, and technical terms, Bryce's Tom Thumb edition of the comedies of William Shakespeare, including a foreword on the author, another book whose pages were all blank, called Memoranda, and the last but not least, Arrietty's favorite, Bryce's Tom Thumb Diary and Proverb book. I'm getting a call, but I'm just going to ignore it for now. With a saying for each day of the year, and as a preface, the life story of a little man called General Tom Thumb, who married a girl called Mercy Lavinia Bump. There was an engraving of their carriage and pair with little horses the size of mice. Arrietty was not a stupid girl. She knew that horses could not be as small as mice, but she did not realize that Tom Thumb, nearly 2 feet high, would seem a giant to a borrower. Arrietty had learned to read from these books, and to write by leaning sideways and copying out the writing that was on the walls. In spite of this, she did not always keep her diary, although on most days she would take the book out for the sake of the saying, which sometimes would comfort her. Today it said, You may go farther and fare worse. And underneath, Order of the Garter instituted 1348. She carried the book to the fire and sat down with her feet on the hob. "What are you doing, Arrietty?" called Homily from the kitchen. "Writing my diary." "Oh," exclaimed Homily shortly. "What did you want?" asked Arrietty. She felt quite safe. Homily liked her to write. Homily encouraged any form of culture. Homily herself, poor ignorant creature, could not even say the alphabet. "Oh, nothing," said Homily crossly, banging away the pan lids. "It'll do later." Arrietty took out her pencil. It was a small white pencil with a piece of silk cord attached, which had come off a dance program. But even so, in Arrietty's hand, it looked like a rolling pin. "Arrietty!" called Homily again from the kitchen. "Yes?" "Put a little something on the fire, will you?" Arrietty braced her muscles and heaved the book off her knees and stood it upright on the floor. They kept the fuel, assorted slack and crumbled candle grease, in a pewter mustard pot and shoveled it out with a spoon. Arrietty trickled only a few grains, tilting the mustard spoon, not to spoil the blaze. Then she stood there, basking in the warmth. It was a charming fireplace, made by Arrietty's grandfather with a cogwheel from the stables, part of an old cider press. The spokes of the cogwheel stood out in starry rays, and the fire itself nestled in the center. Above, there was a chimney piece made from a small brass funnel, inverted. That means flipped upside down. This, at one time, belonged to an oil lamp, which matched it, and which stood in the old days in the hall table upstairs. An arrangement of pipes from the spout of the funnel carried the fumes into the kitchen flues above. The fire was laid with matchsticks and fed with assorted slack, and as it burned up, the iron would become hot, and Homily would simmer soup on the spokes in a silver thimble, and Arrietty would broil nuts. How cozy those winter evenings could be! Arrietty, her great book on her knees, sometimes reading aloud. Pod, at his last, he was a shoemaker and made button boots out of kid gloves, now alas only for his family, and Homily quite at last with her knitting. Homily knitted their jerseys and stockings on black-headed pins, and sometimes on darning needles. A great reel of silk or cotton would stand table-high beside her chair, and sometimes, if she pulled too sharply, the reel would tip up and roll away out the open door into the dusty passage beyond, and Arrietty would be sent after it to rewind it carefully as she rolled it back. The floor of the sitting room was carpeted with deep red blotting paper, which was warm and cozy and soaked up the spills. Homily would renew it at intervals when it became available upstairs. But since Aunt Sophie had taken to her bed, Mrs. Driver seldom thought of blotting paper unless suddenly there were guests. Homily liked things which saved washing, because drying was difficult under the floor. Water they had plenty, hot and cold, thanks to Pod's father, who had tapped the pipes from the kitchen boiler. They bathed in a small tureen, which once had held pâté de foie gras. When he had wiped out the bath, you were supposed to put the lid back to stop people putting things in it. The soap, too, a great cake of it, hung on a nail in the scullery, and they scraped pieces off. Homily liked coal tar, but Pod and Arrietty preferred sandalwood. So the tureen that they're in is kind of like a gravy boat. It's something that you would use when you were eating, but they use that as a bath. And then they have a big chunks of soap that they keep somewhere else, and they call it the scullery. It's kind of like just a storage room that they have, and they will cut chunks of soap off to be able to use. "What are you doing now, Arrietty?" called Homily from the kitchen. "Oh, still writing my diary." Once again, Arrietty took hold of the book and heaved it back onto her knees. She licked the lead of her great pencil and stared a moment, deep in thought. She allowed herself, when she did remember to write, one little line on each page, because she would never, of this she was sure, have another diary. And if she could get 20 lines on each page, the diary would last her 20 years. She had kept it for nearly 2 years already, and today, 22nd of March, she read last year's entry, Mother Cross. She thought a while longer. Then at last she put ditto marks under Mother and worried under Cross. "What'd you say you were doing, Arietti?" called Homily from the kitchen. Arietti closed the book. "Nothing," she said. "Then chop me up that onion. There's a good girl. Your father's late tonight." All right. So we'll stop there. Ditto marks, by the way, are like two little lines that you can put underneath something, and it means that that word also goes underneath where the first word was. All right? So hopefully you're getting a good idea of the borrowers and their house and where they live and how they take things that are just regular to us but put them in their house and they seem gigantic and they use them for other things. So we'll get to know the borrowers a little bit better.